A plastic nozzle clicks shut after dispensing exactly 20 litres of diesel into a civilian sedan. Beside it, a queue of vehicles stretches for 900 metres under the morning sun, paralysed. This is Crimea on a Tuesday morning. At the same moment, 1,000 kilometres to the east, a black column of smoke rises from the distillation columns of the Krasnodar oil refinery. The contrast is mathematical. 20 litres of fuel at a local pump against millions of barrels of processing capacity destroyed overnight. This is not a temporary supply disruption. It is the visible surface of a deeper systemic failure. The map of the war did not alter its borders today, but the physical reality supporting those borders dissolved. And to understand how a peninsula housing a massive military garrison runs out of fuel in a single morning, one must look at the geography of isolation. Russia spent a decade transforming Crimea into an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Fortresses require food, ammunition, and above all, petroleum. An army in the field consumes roughly 40,000 tons of fuel per week just to maintain defensive operations. To feed this appetite, Moscow relied on 3 connections. The first was the Kerch Strait ferries, which cease operations whenever winds exceed 15 meters per second. The second was the Crimean Bridge, a multi-billion-dollar concrete span engineered to carry 40 trains per day. But a hidden structural vulnerability changed its utility. After the explosions of the early war, Russian security protocols banned the transit of heavy fuel tankers across the bridge to protect the integrity of the rail arches. The entire logistics model collapsed onto a single remaining asphalt line. This line is the R280 highway. Moscow officially renamed it the Novorossiya Highway, elevating a stretch of tarmac into a geopolitical symbol. It runs from Rostov-on-Don, snakes through the occupied lowlands of southern Ukraine, and terminates in Simferopol. It is a 300-kilometer choke point. Every shell, every loaf of bread, and every drop of diesel keeping the southern group of forces alive must travel this road. The Russian military command constructed its entire theater strategy on the assumption that this corridor was untouchable. They positioned their air defense networks to shield the front lines, leaving the deep rear to function as an unprotected conveyor belt. The vulnerability of a conveyor belt is that it relies on continuous, unhindered movement. In the summer of 2023, the Ukrainian military attempted to break this system through direct kinetic force. They threw mechanized brigades equipped with Western armor against defensive lines guarded by millions of anti-tank mines. The military measured its results in single villages captured at the cost of hundreds of armored vehicles. The dense fortifications proved impervious to frontal assault because the Russian artillery never ran out of ammunition and the tanks never ran out of fuel. The system at the front remained rigid because the system in the rear remained intact. In 2026, the doctrine changed completely. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry termed the new approach a logistics lockdown. The objective shifted from capturing the trench line to vaporizing the 100 kilometers behind it. The weapon of choice is no longer a multi-million-dollar cruise missile fired in isolation. It is a mass-produced airframe designed to exploit a specific economic asymmetry. The 412th Nevsis Brigade deployed previously classified long-range strike drones built to bypass heavy electronic interference. These autonomous airframes operate deep behind the lines, ignoring the wall of GPS jamming that previously shielded the rear. They do not target fortified bunkers. They target moving trucks. A standard Russian fuel tanker carries 16,000 liters of combustible liquid. It is a soft target, protected only by thin steel sheets. To destroy it, Ukraine introduced the Hornet drone, an American-designed system that operates without human intervention during its terminal phase. The machine utilizes onboard computer vision to identify the specific silhouette of a fuel truck against the asphalt. The production of a 5-kilogram warhead requires a few $1,000s. Replacing the tanker, its liquid cargo, and the trained driver demands hundreds of thousands. When this equation repeats 30 times a night, the economic balance flips. The cost curve runs entirely in favor of the attacker. This mathematical attrition manifested visibly on the morning of June 2nd. The R280 highway began burning in 3 distinct locations simultaneously. A burning tanker does not merely represent lost fuel, it represents a physical blockade on a narrow 2-lane bottleneck. The entire northern supply chain ground to a halt. Occupation officials immediately initiated damage control. The Russian-installed governor of Sevastopol announced that the fuel shortages were temporary and urged citizens to remain calm. However, the administrative response lacked internal cohesion. While the executive branch preached stability, a regional representative publicly compared the strike campaign to the historical siege of Leningrad. The propaganda framing was deliberate, but it revealed a profound structural truth. By invoking a historical siege, the administration admitted that isolation was no longer a theoretical risk. It was a functioning reality. A siege does not require an army to storm the gates. It requires the gates to be locked from the outside until the resources inside vanish. The crisis extends far beyond the borders of the peninsula. The economic model funding the entire military occupation has begun to buckle under the strain of this infrastructure destruction. The Kremlin's economy ministry quietly slashed its growth forecasts for 2026 downward to 0.4%, a drop from the previous projection of 1.3%. The National Treasury reported that the first quarter experienced actual economic contraction for the first time in 36 months. Inflation passed 5%, forcing an emergency legislative increase of the value-added tax from 20 to 22% to plug a multi-trillion ruble federal deficit. The domestic economic boom from military spending has hit its physical limits, leaving behind a structural crisis. Internal reports from Russian financial officials to the presidency stated explicitly that current military expenditures are no longer affordable. The state budget requires global oil prices to remain above $100 per barrel for 12 consecutive months to maintain basic stability. Instead, the domestic infrastructure required to process and export that oil is systematically vaporizing under nightly drone strikes. The drone detonating above the Krasnodar refinery and the deficit widening in the Moscow treasury are the same phenomenon viewed from different angles. The system has entered a phase where its resource requirements exceed its structural capacity to generate them. The lines on the map remain unchanged, but the physical engine driving them has begun to fail. The collapse of a complex logistics network does not occur as a single catastrophic explosion. It progresses through the quiet, sequential failure of small, irreplaceable components. A specialized fuel tanker is not an ordinary transport vehicle. It requires low-alloy steel barrels, internal surge baffles, and explosion-proof pumping systems. When 60 tankers incinerate on the R280 highway within 48 hours, the loss is absolute. Russia operates a finite fleet of 4,000 heavy fuel transport vehicles assigned to the southern military district. The domestic manufacturing sector cannot replace them because the automated welding systems and precision flow valves require imported German and Italian components blocked by trade restrictions. The military command attempted to resolve this transport deficit through administrative coercion. They ordered regional civilian logistics firms to surrender 20% of their commercial truck fleets to the Ministry of Defense. This decision immediately severed the supply chains of regional agricultural distribution hubs. Food processing plants in Krasnodar could no longer transport dairy and grain products to urban centers. Within 72 hours, the wholesale price of basic foodstuffs inside the occupied territories surged by 28%. The intervention to save the military transport apparatus crippled the civilian infrastructure that sustained it. The second failure mechanism manifested within the regional rail network. The logistics command shifted the fuel transit burden to the rail lines running from Rostov through the Donbass toward the Zhankoy junction in northern Crimea. Rail transport is mathematically efficient but structurally rigid. A freight train cannot swerve to avoid an obstructed track. The forced arrival of 80 additional fuel trains per day completely overwhelmed the switching yards of Zhankoy. The station transformed into a dense, stationary mass of volatile cargo visible to commercial satellite radar. This concentration of rolling stock triggered the next link in the chain reaction. Ukrainian forces deployed long-range artillery systems to scatter smart submunitions over the rail choke points. They did not target the heavily armored locomotives. Instead, they targeted the digital track switches and the electrical overhead pantograph lines. A single severed copper line paralyzes an entire rail section for 12 hours. As the trains backed up into 1,000-meter queues, millions of liters of diesel remained static in an active combat zone. Turning the logistical lifeline into a giant open-air target, this gridlock accelerated the depletion of tactical stockpiles on the peninsula itself. The Black Sea Fleet and the airbases at Saki and Gvardiskoye operate on a rigid consumption schedule. A single squadron of Su-34 fighter bombers burns 48 tons of aviation kerosene during a single multi-role mission. By Thursday afternoon, the tactical reserves at the main naval fuel depot in Sevastopol dropped below the critical 30% threshold. The command faced an existential choice: fuel the combat aircraft or maintain the patrol boats guarding the harbour against maritime drones. They chose the aircraft, leaving the naval perimeter completely exposed. The structural decay then forced a fatal reallocation of defensive assets. To protect the remaining rail links and the Dyzhankoy junction, the Russian General Staff withdrew 3 S-400 air defense batteries from the oil-producing regions of western Russia. They repositioned them around the Crimean gateways. This created an immediate radar and interceptor vacuum over the domestic refining heartland. The defensive perimeter of the Kuban region, which processes 12% of Russia's domestic fuel, dissolved overnight. The Ukrainian command immediately exploited this vacancy. The subsequent strike on the Ilsky and Krasnodar refineries targeted the primary distillation units, specifically the AVDU-6 fractionating columns. These columns are 80-meter steel towers that separate crude oil into gasoline, diesel and jet fuel under precise thermal conditions. They cannot be patched or bypassed. They require specialized metallurgical casting that Russia cannot replicate domestically. The destruction of 2 columns instantly removed 110,000 barrels of daily refining capacity from the national balance sheet. The loss of processing capacity triggered a reverse economic feedback loop. Crude oil continued to pump out of Siberian wells at a rate of 9 million barrels per day, but it had nowhere to go. Storage tanks at the pipeline terminals filled to maximum capacity within 4 days. When storage fills, operators must cap the wells. Capping a well in permafrost regions causes the water content within the borehole to freeze, permanently destroying the geological structure of the extraction point. To prevent total asset destruction, Russia attempted to dump the unrefined crude onto the international market through the port of Novorossiysk. The international shipping market responded to the heightened risk with mathematical precision. Maritime insurance syndicates raised war risk premiums for vessels entering the Black Sea by 400%. The cost of chartering a single Aframax tanker increased from $40,000 to $160,000 per day. The increased shipping costs absorbed the entirety of the profit margin. Russia began spending more money to extract and move the oil than it received from the buyers. The final breakdown occurred within the social architecture of the occupied peninsula. As commercial gas stations displayed no fuel signs, the civilian population began hoarding resources. The black market price of a litre of regular gasoline reached 700 rubles, a tenfold increase from the official capped price. Local police units, whose salaries had lost 15% of their purchasing power due to the VAT increase, began hijacking military fuel trucks to resell the cargo to private entities. The chain of command broke under economic pressure. The system reached the precise moment where the state could no longer enforce its own laws, and the military could no longer move its own wheels. The structural limits had expired. The operational paralysis of the Southern Front introduces a permanent macroeconomic crisis that the Russian state cannot solve with monetary policy. By June 2026, the physical absence of fuel on the peninsula forces the Kremlin into a zero-sum administrative triage. The state must decide whether to allocate the remaining diesel reserves to the agricultural harvesters of the Kuban, the civilian transport grids of the occupied territories, or the mechanized regiments fighting in Zaporizhia. The Central Bank of Russia faces a structural trilemma where capping fuel prices creates immediate black market deficits, while printing rubles to subsidize transport costs drives domestic inflation past 8%. The economy has ceased to function as a unified engine, splitting instead into isolated regional survival zones. This internal fracture permanently alters the geopolitical calculus of the Black Sea basin. For a century, The possession of Crimea allowed Moscow to project naval power across the Mediterranean. The systematic cutting of the R280 land corridor transforms the peninsula from an offensive launchpad into a vulnerable logistical hostage. The Black Sea Fleet had already evacuated its surface combatants from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk to escape maritime drones. Now, the destruction of the Krasnodar refineries deprives those same ships of their localized industrial fuel base. The geographic buffer that traditionally insulated Russia's southern maritime trade has dissolved, exposing its primary commercial ports to direct economic strangulation. The tactical countermeasures implemented by the Russian General Staff reveal the acute desperation of the military command. To preserve the remaining transport fleet, the Ministry of Defense mandated that all military cargo convoys on the R280 route must operate exclusively at night, maintain a minimum speed of 120 km per hour, and carry an observer equipped with portable drone detectors. This directive ignores the material limitations of heavy logistics. Forcing 40-ton tanker trucks to navigate shell-damaged, unlit roads at high speeds significantly increases mechanical failure rates and fatal collisions. The attempt to outrun the threat merely substitutes drone strikes with self-inflicted structural attrition. And furthermore, the mechanism chosen to protect these convoys accelerates the degradation of the active front line. To shield the asphalt corridor, commanders stripped frontline infantry units of their mobile electronic warfare systems and redeployed those units to escort the civilian trucks carrying military cargo. This leaves the trenches on the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia axes completely exposed to tactical quadcopters. The infantry pays the physical price for the survival of the logistics network. For every fuel truck that successfully traverses the land bridge, a defensive position at the front line loses its electronic protection, causing a measurable spike in frontline personnel casualties. The administrative attempts to insulate the broader Russian economy from the refinery strikes have proved equally counterproductive. The Ministry of Energy attempted to stabilize the internal market by implementing a complete ban on gasoline exports and ordering a massive rerouting of unrefined crude oil toward the Far East via the rail network. This decision immediately encountered the physical limitations of Russian rail capacity. The Eastern Polygon, comprising the Baikal-Amur and Trans-Siberian railways, already operates at maximum capacity, carrying coal and military hardware to Asian markets. Inserting millions of tons of stranded crude oil into this bottleneck caused a systemic gridlock, leaving thousands of freight cars stranded in Siberia for weeks. This infrastructural gridlock exposes the complete irreversibility of the damage inflicted on Russia's refining sector. A modern petrochemical plant is not a collection of standard parts that an engineering crew can rapidly replace. The fractionating columns destroyed at the Ilsky and Novoshakhtinsk facilities require custom metallurgy and automated manufacturing processes that exist exclusively within Western supply chains. Domestic machine-building firms lack the technical documentation to replicate these systems. The minimum recovery timeline for a single primary distillation unit under current sanctions exceeds 24 months, meaning the processing capacity vanishes permanently from the national balance sheet. The true scale of the crisis resides in this temporal asymmetry. Ukraine destroys an industrial asset in 30 minutes using an unpiloted vehicle that takes 48 hours to assemble in a workshop. Russia requires 2 years, millions of dollars of sanctioned capital, and external technical expertise to rebuild that identical asset. The Russian state is burning through its historical reserves of material and financial capital at a rate that completely outstrips its domestic replacement capacity. The state budget enters its 5th consecutive year of deficit, while the National Wealth Fund retains less than half of its liquid assets. The economic model has transitioned from a self-sustaining wartime economy to a terminal asset-stripping operation. This structural reality strips away the illusion of a frozen conflict or a sustainable stalemate. The stability of a defensive line does not depend on the courage of the soldiers inside the earthworks. It depends on the continuous arrival of the supply train. When the highway burns, the rail yard jams, and the refinery throws smoke into the sky, the front line begins to lose its material cohesion. The current reality of the war is not defined by a dramatic breakthrough on a map, but by the quiet accumulation of unresolvable shortages. The system has passed the point where administrative orders can alter the mathematical balance. The tank is empty, the capital is spent, and the road back is blocked.